I would start by asking what is a spell, but lucky for us the game does categorize spells as a standalone card type, and as of recently even allows you to sort by spells so you would see all of them. I however will be excluding Graveyard and Goblin Barrel as they are win conditions and were a part of this video I made. But what makes spells unique from other cards in the game? Typically the most common answer would be the fact that you can place it on the opponent's arena side. But then you have stuff like Miner with that ability ruining this rule, and spells like Log and Royal Delivery which behave like troops in terms of where they can be deployed. Another answer could be based on them being a single use, but spirits are that as well. From what I noticed, spells are the only card that doesn't have an HP bar, which means they can't be taken out by anything really. On surface level, they have three main uses, being to take out troops or buildings, the second is to finish off low HP crown towers, and the final one being some goofy mechanic that would support your push in some way. When you dive deeper, they are actually the card type that has potential to influence your game the most out of any other card. Pop quiz. Enemy placed barbarians on the bridge, and in your hand you have Fireball, Wizard, Giant, and Zap. What do you do? Wait, did you just say Giant? What is wrong with you? Fireball might seem to be the obvious choice as it's a +1 trade. Unfortunately, it's a wrong answer. In this case, you go with Wizard, which might seem like an equal trade, but considering the fact your Wizard is still at full HP, which in reality makes it a +5 trade. The appropriate time to pick Fireball over Wizard is when the barbarians are on the enemy side and are threatening your push and need to be taken out as soon as possible. In that case, even if you fireballed a goblin gank for a negative trade, it for the most part is worth it to keep your giant safe for longer and for the tower damage. Starting off with the heaviest spell in the game, and it's Rocket. For 6 elixir you get a projectile based nuke that will fly from the king tower all the way to wherever you placed it. The fact it has to fly out means it's subject to distance, therefore it hits slower the more far away you place it from your king tower. This, combined with how small the radius is on this thing, is the reason it's one of the most commonly missed spells in the game. But with great risk comes great reward, as Rocket is capable of dealing absurd damage to everything that's inside of that radius. While it does one-shot majority of the cards in the game, playing it can leave you exposed as it takes away 60% of your elixir bar. Oh god, I'm so out of elixir. And because of that, it's hard to find decent times to use it frequently, so it might sit in your hand as a dead card for a long time. Which is why Rocket is mostly seen in cycle decks, as they would have less issues playing the game with 3 card slots, as they can easily just cycle 1 elixir troop to get to their desired card. It can also act as a secondary win condition, as the damage it does on tower is borderline enough to justify not having another win condition besides it, especially since you can cycle them pretty quickly in double and triple elixir. Next we got Fireball. For 4 elixir you summon a projectile spell that leaves a big explosion taking out medium health troops instantly. However, it's faster and has a bigger radius, so it's easier to hit stuff with it. And while it's easy to just throw it there and hit that balloon randomly, positioning it in a way to get the maximum knockback would actually give you better results, so practice your timings very well. A lot of the times, Fireball is used to clip the tower while hitting a ranged troop that's typically around the same cost or more expensive. These troops are literally called fireballies, as their HP is intentionally made to be slightly more than the damage the fireball deals. Which is why Fireball is usually always paired with a 2 elixir small spell rather than a more medium spell like Arrows or Delivery. Most troops that die in one shot to it are usually annoying, like Mother Witch, which needs an immediate response, or Magic Archer that would chip down thousands of damage on your tower when not dealt with immediately. And when you're attacking, things like Barbarians would shred your push if not fireballed instantly, or Zappies which can stun lock a single unit and single-handedly take it out entirely. Oftentimes, you want to save the fireball for that specific annoying troop your opponent uses, which makes them as irrelevant as the witch. Please buff the witch. This resulted in an entire archetype that uses multiple of these troops to try and bait you to use your fireball on one of them, which would allow them to spam the rest of their troops without worrying about them dying. Next we got Poison. For 4 elixir, you get a non-projectile based spell that deals damage over somewhat a long duration of time. Just wanna explain, being a non-projectile spell means it doesn't account for travel time, so it spawns at the same time regardless of how far it is played from your king tower. Also, non-projectile based spells are immune to being reflected by the monk's ability, while projectile based ones are not immune to that. Poison is most comparable to Fireball, as they deal extremely similar amount of damage, with Poison dealing a little bit more than Fireball if you manage to get all the poison ticks on the same target. This means the Fireballies all would die to poison without needing a small spell to deal the final blow on them. But that doesn't mean you can just change Fireball into poison in any deck. For instance, in a beatdown deck, poison is extremely unnecessary, as if they played barbarians on your giant, the poison is not gonna take them out in time. You're just better off taking the instant damage of the Fireball, even though it deals less damage on towers and is harder to hit. And in decks like Hog Rider, Fireball tends to be more favorable, as you want to eliminate the building to get your hog on tower as quick as possible, whereas with Poison, your hog will die before the spell duration is over, so it typically just doesn't work like that. The decks that does well with it are things like Graveyard, since it lasts a few seconds, so playing a Poison with it ends up as some sort of a protection coat for your graveyard. Miner and Goblin Drill also tend to prefer Poison, as they work very similarly to Graveyard, so the higher total damage on both troops and towers is very helpful for them. Another thing Poison does better is dealing with spawners, as the longer duration allows it to eliminate more waves overall, compared to how Fireball would only be able to take out one wave because the damage is instant. Defense wise, it still is very good. In fact, it's very common to use it on defense, especially against heavy pushes. Sure, the duration makes it slightly worse on defense against nearly everything, especially annoying Fireball bait cards like Flying Machine, but it also does make it much better at dealing with shields than Fireball. As you can see here, Poison nearly takes out an Evo Wizard on its own, while Fireball gets completely wasted on his shield. Next we got Lightning. For 6 elixir, you get a non-projectile spell that slaps 3 lightning bolts, dealing insane damage to the troops it strikes. Despite its similarity to Rocket, the fact that it only takes out 3 troops makes it significantly worse at defense, but the bigger radius makes it great on offense, since it makes it easier to hit multiple things with it, giving you more value. The lightning bolts prioritizes unit with more HP, which isn't inherently a good or a bad thing, as it depends on what you're doing. For example, it makes it easier to snipe support troops from in between swarms, as you can easily tell where the lightning will go. But also, that means it's theoretically possible for your opponent to block it by playing tanky stuff around the troop they wanna save. Blocking it majority of the time is unreliable or straight up not worth it. Besides, lightning is mostly used against buildings, and their high HP makes them nearly impossible to save for a reasonable cost. Tombstone is like the only one that's possible to do that, but honestly, who would tank lightning with barbs for a tombstone? Blocking starts becoming annoying when the enemy tower is very low on HP, because they can just spam goblins and stuff just to waste your lightning, which is why when you want to finish off a tower, it's best to play the lightning in an unexpected position. Besides the high damage, the lightning bolt acts like the zap, as it would reset Inferno Tower or Sparky. Lightning is mostly adopted by beatdown decks in general, but it works better with some cards more than others. For example, with Giant it's pretty mid, because the Giant is weak on his own and would rather have a big push and just use zap for resetting stuff. But with Electro Giant it's a different story, as he is a formidable force by himself, so using it to take down buildings is usually worth it. And on top of that, anything that doesn't die to it will be killed by his reflection damage, so they go well together. Goblin Giant and Ram Rider have the same mechanic, but they usually prefer Rage, as unlike Electro Giant, it can speed up their damaging mechanic. Next we got Zap. For 2 elixir, you get a non-projectile spell that deals light damage and stuns its targets. Most of the time, Zap will be used to eliminate small swarm cards like skeletons, bats, and spear goblins. When it comes to other moderate swarm cards like minions and stab goblins, it leaves them 1 tower shot away from dying. The stun it does gives it a unique ability that no other spell has, and it's retargeting things. For example, if the enemy tower is targeting my mini P.E.K.K.A, I can zap it and make it change targets to the miner that's already behind it. That kinda makes Zap unusable in graveyard decks, cause why would you wanna make their tower target on your skeletons? It also allows you to reset Inferno towers, preventing your tank from melting like an ice cream in a hot summer day. It also causes Sparky to restart its attack from scratch. Needless to say, Zap is primarily a beatdown spell, not a cycle spell. Next we got Rage. For 2 elixir, you get a non-projectile small spell that leaves a circle which boosts your troop speed. Despite being a non-projectile spell, it spawns a bottle which gives it some delay, making it a bit slower than Zap. But that bottle, if played exactly at the same time as an enemy building, it would push said building away and ruin the placement. This is near impossible to pull in a real match, but I thought it was unique enough to include and can be a hype play if you manage to pull it off. Now Rage also deals damage, as the damage is identical to that of the Zap, so interactions are the same. Although without the stun, it makes it slightly worse on defense in some cases, but with the extra speed it makes it better in other cases. Besides that, it's great with troops that have special action that triggers based on their attacks, since it allows them to trigger it more frequently. Aside from the evolved Royal Giant, the Monk also has a special ability every 3 hits, so Rage does help him abuse that. And a few other evolutions also offer a similar mechanic, but so far this mechanic isn't really that heavily used in the game. Naturally, Rage fits in beatdown decks, as the effect of getting rid of some skeletons while boosting your entire push is really good for them. But unlike Zap, using it in some cycle decks can be a good idea depending on what deck we are talking about. Next we got Snowball. For 2 elixir, you get a projectile spell that deals light damage, pushes troops away, and slows them down. Snowball deals slightly less damage than Rage and Zap, but for the most part has the same interactions as them. The pushback and slowing makes it peak on defense compared to the other 2 spells. It can do things that Rage and Zap are not capable of. Especially if you time your pushback perfectly, the amount of value you can get from it is nice. Or you can even activate the King Tower in some really niche specific scenarios. And while it isn't capable of resetting things like Sparky, the pushback allows it to reset some troops like Inferno Dragon or even Fisherman. When it comes to offense, it really depends on the win condition more than the archetype itself. Graveyard picks it over Zap because it doesn't force the tower to retarget, and the slowing it does can get you some extra damage. Ram Rider does so well with it because the pushback synergizes with the snare mechanic incredibly well. Next we got the Log. For 2 elixir you get a funny tree projectile that can only be placed on your side and goes in a straight line. What makes this spell special is the pushback it has, because unlike any other spell, it affects everything, including a whole ass golem. This knockback can reset a lot of troops as it interrupts their abilities, and since it is effective against everything, it can stop even a Prince charge. It also deals a ridiculous amount of damage compared to the rest of the small spells. The catch is, it doesn't target air troops, so it's a bit limiting. The way it works is, it hits each troop once, so even if I nado them back, they won't get hit again. However, this doesn't apply to spawned troops, as it counts them as a separate entity. This is useful when you want to deal that final blow to, say, a goblin drill while also killing the death spawned goblins. The travel time makes it kind of ineffective at offense unless you have a solid prediction, but all this range makes it possible to defend stuff and chip the enemy tower at the same time. And for those 2 reasons, it mainly is a cycle archetype spell. Next we got Barbarian Barrel. For 2 elixir you get a projectile based barrel that spawns a barbarian when it's done rolling. Obviously it makes sense to compare it to the Log directly, as it functions extremely similarly. It travels a much shorter distance because having a barbarian spawn on top of the tower is broken, but if left ignored, he can get a shot against a Prince's Tower. The Log is actually more thick than the Barbarian Barrel. That means while you can play it behind the tower to cover all Goblin Barrel positions, Barbarian Barrel can't cover side barrels and is generally harder to hit. And when it comes to damage, it has less damage that it can't kill Princess or Rascal Girls. Now obviously that's ignoring the Barbarian that spawns. If we take him into account, Barbarian can deal with things a Log can't, like Bomber or Archers given the enemy didn't protect them. Like on defense, it can do a lot of things Log can't even dream of doing. Defensively, it's just better in every way imaginable except for the lack of knockback it has. On offense, due to its range, everything will be safe if played far from the bridge, so it's a different story. That's not to say it's useless, as some ranged units are better surrounded, so you might get something going on for you, or use it to snipe buildings that are in an anti-lightning position. Graveyard players often face the issue of people blocking their knight on the bridge to make their skeletons irrelevant. Barbarian Barrel creates an unblockable mini-tank which partially solved this problem. Next we got arrows. For 3 elixir you get a multi-projectile based spell that deals mediocre damage to both air and ground troops. Being multi-projectile means the monk can only reflect the arrows that hit him, not the entire spell. What makes arrows special is its ability to take out multiple heavier troops. Minions, goblins, archers, bombers, rascals, it just takes out so many things. The large radius combined with how it's a multi-layer spell makes predictions with it much less risky and easier to hit. Part of what makes this spell unique is how it goes with other spells. While it doesn't directly synergize with big spells like poison or fireball, you can use them in the same deck if you want to use arrows as your small spell. But if you want, you can use arrows as your big spell. Pairing it with a small spell can substitute for a fireball for the most part. While they do take out magic archers and mother witches, the line is drawn at skeleton dragons and of course barbarians and other stuff that usually survive that. Their main use in the meantime is really just to get rid of most evolutions. Like going against Evolved Firecracker without arrows in your deck is literally a traumatic experience. It all started when I took arrows out of my deck and boom, Evo Cracker.
Oh my god, I don't fucking care.
And since it focuses on taking out defensive cards, it mainly is a beatdown spell rather than a cycle one. Next we got Royal Delivery. For 3 elixir you get a spell that takes way too long to deploy but deals a ton of damage and spawns a single recruit. Despite it looking like a projectile, the monk doesn't reflect it. One of the downsides of this spell is that it can only be played on your side like the log, but I can understand why, because a recruit spawning on your tower is broken. Also, its slow deployment time makes it unreliable at defending things like Goblin Barrel unless you predict it earlier. But the upsides of it is how it deals nearly the same damage as Fireball, which is absurd. Dealing with both air and ground troops at the same time makes it a really nice spell to have. Like bro, look at what you can do with this thing plus a fire spirit and tell me this isn't insane. If all this wasn't enough, the recruit when left ignored can deal damage to the tower, so it will force your opponent to waste elixir on him. And while it doesn't reset charging troops like Ram Rider and Battle Ram, against let's say a prince, the recruit would be able to sack the charge and stop it. Being strictly defensive makes it something beatdown decks don't care about because it can't help their pushes. Instead, it got adopted by cycle decks because it's great at taking out major threats very reliably. It's mostly good against beatdown pushes which are really slow, so the drop speed doesn't really hold it back that much. Besides, cards like skeletons can help hold enemy troops in place while you wait for your Amazon package to drop. Another reason it's a cycle spell is because of its amazing synergy with the log. Combined with the log, it deals more damage than Fireball, which takes out plenty of hard to deal with troops. Besides, when you play 2 cards as a Fireball substitute instead of just the Fireball itself, it helps you cycle back to your win condition much quicker. It also does great with Earthquake, as these 2 combined would take out things like Magic Archer. It's less effective as it doesn't fully deal Fireball damage and even costs more elixir in general. However, if you manage to clip something with the Earthquake during your push, then they can't counter push with it, or else you can just delivery on them and they are dead for free. Next we got Goblin Curse. For 2 elixir you get a non-projectile spell that turns everything that dies inside of it into a dagger goblin. Despite it looking like a small spell, I personally don't consider it to be a small spell, but rather a gimmick spell like Clone and Freeze. The main reason is because unlike small spells, it doesn't do well on defense on its own. That makes it unreliable and an investment to use in most cases, as you can just use it alone on most of the things. And when you compare it to other spells like Snowball and Log, it doesn't have slowing or pushback to help it on defense. Sure, the Goblin's death spawn can hold off the troops for some time, but it's unreliable, and it needs something else to quickly kill a skeleton first, in which if a miner is tanking for them, it's over for you. And for those reasons, it usually is a dead card in your hand, and you would only use it a handful of times per match. But what makes Goblin Curse unique is the damage amplification it has. Everything that's inside it will take extra damage from all sources. This means you want to play the curse first and then play your spell if you plan on sniping something. Doing the opposite of that will result in less overall damage and might even make some troops survive both spells. Not many people use this card, but I have a feeling it will fit in cycle decks for a few reasons. First of all, instead of playing arrows on Firecracker, you can just play Curse and Log, which cycles 2 cards and gets you more tower damage from the goblin itself. Second point is, when let's say defending a goblin gang, instead of just logging it, you can Curse Log it, which adds up to you getting a slightly better goblin gang for just 2 extra elixir. And third of all, since Curse is lackluster on its own, playing a cheap card with it is much less taxing, especially when the alternative is playing a very expensive card with it. Next we got Earthquake. For 3 elixir you get a non-projectile spell that specializes in destroying buildings. Even though it focuses on buildings, the troop damage on it isn't bad at all. As you can see, it does take out dagger goblins, but it still deals less damage than Log. As you can see here, the princess survives it, so it's not much worth it compared to arrows. However, when it comes to buildings, it is a beast, as the damage it does to them is greater than Firebolt. It's the only thing that can kill a grounded Tesla. That's how good it is against buildings. And needless to say, it destroys Pump for half the cost if you ignore the 2 elixir your opponent gets back. The radius on it allows you to get some decent tower damage while taking out an enemy building, and the troop damage combined with the log can take out some squishy support troops, which is great because you can earthquake on them when they are behind and get tower damage, and then if they make a push with that troop, you can log them and their tank plus more damage on the tower, so that's nice. This spell is mostly used in cycle decks, especially with Hog Rider and Royal Hogs. Their fast speed makes them very hard to stop without a building, and an earthquake eliminates that for a positive trade. Besides, it also slows down troops, which makes it a bit harder for them to catch up with your Hog. Aside from Hog, it can see some action in Electro Giant decks as buildings give him clinical depression. Being half the cost of the lightning means you are able to better support your Electro Giant, and what would you need a lightning for when you can just pull their stuff into his ring of death? Next we got Void. For 3 elixir you get a non-projectile spell that deals damage based on the number of troops inside it. When there is 1 troop inside, it nearly deals the same damage as Rocket, which is insane given it's half the cost. This is usually what you want to use it for, as taking out key troops for a +2 trade is low-key broken. Sure, it doesn't give any tower damage, but eliminating an entire Inferno tower with it is worth not getting the tower chip. Now, not to say there is no counterplay to it, because you can always play something inside of that Void to downgrade the damage it does. In that context, Void is more effective on your side as a defensive spell since your opponent can't place stuff there. Another counter is playing your ranged stuff in this tile, so the Void will always clip the tower, making it impossible to single them out. When there are 2 to 4 troops inside of it, the damage on it becomes slightly higher than Royal Delivery. This kinda makes it so if you wanna clip the tower with a musketeer, then it would bring its HP down enough to have it die to log afterwards to get you some tower chip damage. Obviously, it's more risky as a 3 troop swarm would be able to ruin it if you already have a troop and the tower in the same radius. Whereas, if you go single target on the musketeer, they would have to play a 4 or more troop swarm cards, which is less common to find and a bit more expensive. The middle damage is usually used along with arrows to take out things like Wizard when it's in the safe spot or getting protected by something. When there's 5 or more troops, it deals more damage than Zap and less damage than Log. It's not entirely worth the elixir cost when used that way, but it can take out things like Lava Pups if you had no other options. It usually stops being effective at minions and anything that has more HP than they do. A notable synergy with the Void is Goblin Curse, as it boosts the damage of the Void, which can be quite helpful. And if they try to block it with Swarm, they get punished as they will die quicker and even turn to goblins that would take out whatever they are trying to protect. Void is mostly used in beatdown decks because it offers a cheaper method to get rid of defensive troops at the expense of tower damage, which is nearly useless for them. It can also be a defensive bailout in some cases, which allows you to save more elixir for offense instead of defense. Next we got Tornado. For 3 elixir you get a non-projectile spell that pulls enemy troops towards the center of it. It does enough damage to take out skeletons and spear goblins, so it passes as both a small spell and a gimmick spell. The special gimmick it offers of moving troops is extremely unique and can't be found in any other card. The pull power depends on the weight of the troop, which is a hidden stat in the game. But it's not counterintuitive, as the bigger the troop is, the heavier it usually is for the most part. It's also worth mentioning that a speed boost on a troop makes them slightly harder to move around with the tornado. This means an ice spirit stopping them for a split second makes them significantly easier to pull around. You often see Tornado paired with a splash card like Executioner, which makes for a very strong defensive combo, or with stuff like Electro Dragon because it allows you to snipe a Sparky or an Inferno Dragon on offense and completely nullify them. Other splash cards can also pierce on towers if you line them up correctly with your Tornado. But what makes this spell even more special is that you can pull things onto your King Tower to activate it. For those unaware, if you take down a tower, the enemy king would pull out a cannon and act as a second tower, but if you directly damage their king, then it would activate and now they have 3 towers. Activating your own king can change some interactions and make defending easier. The most common one is Graveyard, as honestly when a king tower is in play, the Graveyard player borderline already lost the match before it even started. Now some King Tower activations are easier to pull off and result in 0 tower damage, and some of them are easy to get right but would require you to take a punch in the face like this balloon hit to work. And some of them are really hard and require too much practice, but it is worth it to put the time into learning them. If you want me to make a video with every King Tower activation in the game, like this video and subscribe, and I'll see how much demand there is on this topic. Note, I can actually see the stats and notice if people actually liked this video more frequently than the previous videos. Besides king activations, if someone punishes you for say playing a golem in the back, a tornado can cheaply defend a push by transferring the damage onto the king tower. For the most part, games tend to be only a 1 crown or a 2 crown game, so King Tower HP is mostly useless, so might as well use it to save my tower. Just be extra careful from King Tower deactivation. Next we got Freeze. For 4 elixir you get a non-projectile spell that freezes enemy troops for somewhat a long period of time. Freeze is a relatively uncommon spell that barely see any use due to how gimmicky it is, and because of that it tends to catch people off guard the first time it's played, or every time it's played if they have short-term memory loss, But despite that, it kinda sucks because say I play a hog and freeze the enemy mini P.E.K.K.A, which sure might get me a couple extra hits, but now I'm down 8 elixir and will probably be unable to defend the monstrosity coming my way. The only time I wouldn't care about overcommitting with a freeze and keeping enemy troops alive is on sudden death, when the match will end just before my freeze does, and having a card chilling in your hand the entire game just to be used at the end is usually not the nicest thing to deal with, except it's not gonna actually do that. You could use it on defense as it's not really awful when used that way, but it sadly comes at the expense of the surprise factor. The damage on it can take out skeletons, so I guess using it against a skeleton army isn't too horrible in some cases. And you can safely use it on offense if you have troops behind your balloon or whatever that you are confident would take out the enemy troops. Or use it with Graveyard as the skeletons can take stuff out. A 4 elixir freeze for a 4 elixir Mother Witch is a decent trade if you ask me. It usually gets used with balloon and Graveyard decks like I've been showing. Next we got Clone. For 3 elixir you get a non-projectile spell that copies your troops when you play it. The copied troops only have 1 HP, so if your opponent sneezes on them, they are gone. But what makes this spell interesting is, unlike HP, every other stat remains the same. Even the abilities of said card remain the same, so a giant skeleton will get double bombs for like half his original cost. This created a unique card selection for clone decks as they usually tend to have stuff like Skeleton Barrel, as the skeletons already get one shot anyway, or where people abuse spawners like Night Witch, since you can get double the bat spawn with no downsides. But also, on the opposite end of the spectrum, E-Golem player would just be giving you 4 free elixir while gaining practically nothing from their clone. Cards with shields are also interesting as they would survive a spell and stay alive, giving you more and more value. The main problem with this spell is it actually has 0 defensive value, which makes it quite a niche gimmick spell. But that also means the surprise factor Freeze had exists in it as well. Like, a lot of players clone a giant skeleton to push him onto the enemy tower and have the clone continue pushing him, which is honestly very annoying. To make sure clone doesn't break the game, it was specifically coded to not clone champions, because when there is 2 champions on the arena, activating an ability gives you 2 for the price of 1, or in this case, 1,000,000 for the price of 1. This bug was wild. It was also coded so cloning evolutions give regular troop clones because, you know, reasons. Finally, we got Mirror. I can't even do a proper introduction because it can cost 2 elixir or 10 elixir. It can also be a projectile spell and get reflected by the monk, or be a non-projectile spell and be safe from that. The way Mirror works is once you play a card, it will show on the card itself and allow you to play it again for 1 extra elixir. The whole card has nothing too specific to go through because it's basically just other cards, but the whole hype around it is the fact that it gives you over leveled cards. A maxed mirror gives you level 16 cards, which is not a thing in the game as of the time I'm recording this video, and it better not be a thing before 2035. The over leveled cards for the most part don't make much of a massive difference, but in some situations the extra level can drastically change some of the interactions. For what decks typically use mirror, it honestly is just troll decks, as the card kinda sucks. Its only purpose is to ruin the game when an OP card like Goblin Machine is first released, as it allows you to spam it more effectively. If moving through liquid is swimming and moving through gas is flying, what do you call moving through solid? If you get it right, I'll pin your comment, my dude.